Hey everybody, we're back. We got some more class discussion for you, if the title did not denote such. And this time we're talking about clerics. What have you got for us there, Victor?
Well, the cleric as a name or as a term or however you want to put it is a little different from some of the other classes because it's a very broad term and it's not one we use normally in everyday
It
life
does not
because
have huge historical gravity to it.
yeah,
It's
and
more of
it
a large term.
yeah, if you look it up, what it basically says is a member of the clergy. So you have to look, okay, what does clergy mean? And that would be those ordained for religious duties. So fundamentally what a cleric is someone who has been officially given a religious duty. Now this can be very mean many different things. It's sort of like saying that someone is a member of the armed forces. It doesn't tell you anything about what they actually do, just that they're a part of this larger organization. Now, to try and clarify this a little bit, I've decided to try and define some of the terms that we usually associate with the cleric to see what it could mean. Now, first we have the word priest, and to specify that term, that would be someone who is a cleric and is tied to a specific place of worship. The the priest would be the one who is, and well, as I said, they're tied to a specific place. There may be the village, the religious representative of a seat in a specific village or a town or another location of some kind, and yeah, that is this is a it's a very clear, fairly simple one that works for many backgrounds and starting approaches you may have.
Priest kind of falls more into the occupation, whereas in
Yeah,
cleric might be some umbrella term. Priest is probably something that a cleric does before they become an adventurer or whatever is part of your system or setting.
yeah, it's an easy starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the term monk, and we're talking in the Judeo-Christian Western understanding here. We'll get into
Partially bald monk, not full bald monk.
yeah, yeah, and there are some similarities with the other type of monk, but we'll get to that when it's that class. And to define that, that would be a man tied to a monastery and various vows, like of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So this implies a monasterial life for one, and technically also the term is specifically male, but we don't have to apply that otherwise. That's just what the term has been historically. And this implies that your character has made certain vows that would have effects to how you play them and who they are and what they do. And then we have the term friar, which hasn't been defined that often. It's just a term you've heard a few times, and most people just know of Friar Tuck from Robin Hood or something like that. And a friar would be a member of a religious order, something like the Dominican, so the Franciscan order is what we have in history. And these orders can be of the same faith, but have a different understanding of how to interpret the faith. So this means that orders aren't necessarily in full agreement, but they agree that they worship the same deity, so to speak.
So it turns out that cleric and these three terms that are pretty closely tied to the term cleric are not as useful as they would be in directly telling you what we're talking about, much like it was for the bard or the berserker or something like that. It's not terribly evocative, but it is very useful in giving us like some rough guidelines on what we might want to include into our cleric. And to me, that's one of the big strengths of the cleric is that we'll talk about it a little bit more when we go to fighter. But I love that the cleric is almost a blank slate. They have one trait about them, kind of given divine touch, and then the rest of it's kind of up to you how you want to extrapolate from the mechanisms that you get and the spells that you get. That blank slate is very powerful for somebody who really wants to invest a lot of time in fleshing out a character. Not that all classes can't do that, but clerics are among the unique in their blank slatedness.
Yes, and this flexibility also ties into the whole question of what you are worshipping. And a cleric can be any or none of the things of the terms we mentioned, because these are just examples from the real world. There can be there are many other interpretations that apply to other settings and worlds.
Yeah, I do like the ordained for religious duties. I do kind of like that as like the true encapsulation of what I like my clerics to be, is that you have a divine purpose. Now, that divinity is up to you what it is derived from, but something has called you and you are to act. Cleric is my favorite class, and I think it is. There's many facets to why that is, but I think that core tenet is one of the large ones. Is that really, if the DM wants to take and run with that trait by itself, you are given divine duty. You can actually have a huge impact on the narrative, and the narrative can have a huge impact on you. The DM has a lot to go off on with just that line, because that the way that divine responsibility is passed to you can be done in a multitude of ways and can have all kinds of twists and turns associated with it, and it makes it very interesting narratively.
Yeah, you could be a character that was put into a religious service simply as part of a tradition and you didn't necessarily make a choice. It could be something that you went after and earned your way into a position. It could be all kinds of things that have so many potential narrative implications, and how much your character did or didn't get involved in getting to this position can also help inform how they relate to their deity and their faith, because every character, every person has times of doubt, and this is even more relevant to the cleric when things might not seem as clear cut as they once did.
One of my favorite things about giving like a little bit more, lack of a better term, giving a little bit more reality to your character in session is describing mundane acts that you do either while traveling, while camping, or in situations, just real 20-second blurbs, maybe less. And a cleric really gives you that in space. Like you can have lots of inspiration on doing that. The religious rites that you would enact if somebody dies, if there are NPCs that are having a hard time of something. There's a multitude of reasons why rituals would be conducted, and doing a 10-15 second description of a ritual that you're conducting actually is evocative for all the rest of the players at the table, that they kind of understand your character more. Like after every battle, you don't even have to mention it more than once or twice every 5 to 8 sessions, but the fact that maybe you put copper on the eyes of everybody that has been killed in battle as a means of passage or something like that. Like this is something that not only is something that people can kind of hang their hat on to understand who your character is, but it gives a little bit of depth that even after a conflict, there's no hatred from your character. That it is, you still have your rights to do, and you have to protect these souls into crossing. Now, it also makes it interesting when there is a foe that for some reason your cleric goes against those duties because there's something personal about that foe, and that can give huge amounts of character growth. And these rituals can be in anything, and it really fleshes out your character in a low impact way where you're not taking scenes away, you're just taking about 15-second slivers.
Yeah, I've played a cleric once that was, from a mechanical standpoint, it was a life cleric, but he was basically worked as a sort of undertaker prior to becoming an adventurer, and he
I've had the same.
Very focused approach on you respect the dead. Mm-hmm. I don't care who they were when they were living. I don't care what they did to you or anyone else. You don't disrespect the dead.
Yeah, mine was a grave cleric back in Pathfinder, but a very, very similar single trait.
But after a battle, he would he would try and put bodies in respectable positions and make sure to say a short prayer over each one, even if no matter who they were, and things like that. And there was of course a strong dislike of the undead.
Yeah, and and that's undead is a whole aspect that you
Yeah,
can
that we'll get into that.
really decide with your DM, and that's one of the coolest things about clerics is that if you're by the odds of it, most DMs really don't have the religious rites down to the every day in and day out thing done. So if you talk to your DM ahead of time, be like, hey, do you mind if I really just kind of take what this religion is and make it my own? Even if they have established religion, there's all like take a note from reality. All different sects within a religion do things very differently. So you can do just about anything within reason, and your DM is like, cool, that's more, and that informs them for later campaigns or sessions.
Yeah, even in the most defined and previously explained of settings, there can be a religious order that is so small that it hasn't been in the notes before, and therefore your character can be part of that order as be a friar of that order and have their own twist on things that already has a official version,
Yeah.
but your order doesn't do it quite the same.
Yeah, and so you get a lot of freedom in what you're doing with your character and how you can explain that. I really do think clerics are like a very as long as you're okay with the mechanical side, because clerics can be very daunting mechanically. That they're kind of like almost like training wheels for making a character, because a lot of it's kind of handed to you. Like you get a really good skeleton for you to flesh out on like how to make a character. And there's a lot of in other mediums, a lot of examples on religious individuals, whether it be whatever you can think of.
Indeed, and there's an important thing here to discuss, and that is the fact that one of the things that some people are very uncomfortable with the cleric is the idea that if they start acting in a way that their god doesn't fully agree with, a GM could, in theory, although it's you want to know who you're playing with, but a more malicious GM might say that wasn't completely according to your god's tenets. You lose your powers.
Yeah. I don't think that's a problem
It's
nowadays.
not a common problem, but some people are
Yeah.
worried about that stuff.
I think in the like over the top murder hobo days back in like 3.5 or earlier, when it was very antagonistic style play. I think that was a lot more common. I think these days, like, yeah, there's still murder hobos, but I think the culture of antagonistic DMs has kind of been washed out. And I think the pendulum swung too far, but we won't go too deep in it in the cleric video. But
but there, and of course now when we have a much freer alignment system, that is to say, you don't have to necessarily need an alignment system beyond certain specific mechanics, and those can be decided on the spot, more or less.
Yeah,
like detect evil, for example. But that's not a cleric ability. Like that, just for an example.
Ideally, when it regards to going against your divine proclivities, you should really understand that as a cleric, you should be aligned with your god, because that is who this, that it is actually something that defines your character, that you are so devout that for some reason you were given these powers because of your devout nature. Now, if you've talked to your DM and you're like, hey, I want to have a crisis of faith, I want to bend this arc into a different direction, talk to your DM about it, and then see what you guys can do to make it interesting in the narrative without necessarily destroying what your character is. It could be a class change that happens, or whatever in there. But I would err on 9 times out of 10. The reason why you made a cleric is because you wanted somebody who was divinely inspired and given those gifts because how aligned they are with that god, or tapped by that god as some sort of scion. So lean into that. I not that you can't, but it seems kind of weird to choose that. It's like picking a fighter and then only wanting to cast spells. It just like like I guess you could do that. True. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, but it seems kind of backwards.
There's also the question of how common or uncommon is religious. That is to say, how to put it. how common or uncommon is it that someone can pray and actually get a response?
Yeah. I like my clerics to be very rare. That they are like they are miracle makers. They are, they have been tapped, and they are seen as like almost a gift from that god when people find out that you are in fact a cleric. Um, it also can give really interesting things that even like a low ranking member in a religious order immediately gains like rank well outside of their age or their experience because they have been tapped. So this allows them the purview to be able to be like, no, I'm an adventurer now. Like I go out and do God's duty because I'm the only one getting a direct line from God. So I'm going to go do my own stuff and do what is, asked of me. And then you have the very dangerous aspects of like, well, what happens when people higher in the order are very much against you and, or jealous or all these different things that can come from it. And you have friction from your own order because of you've been tapped. But there's many ways to do it. That's just how I prefer it.
Indeed. Because what I have in my setting is that there is a relatively limited set of deities or gods, but they have different interpretations in different cultures. So like the goddess of life and the spiritual, she is understood by some as the mother, and as others as the light, and so on and so forth. So there's and these different interpretations have different ways that they worship, but that doesn't mean that the deity in question is opposed to any of them. It simply means that they acknowledge the differences of culture and such in various ways, shapes, and forms. Mm-hmm. There's also something that I don't know how common this was back in the day, but I feel like this is a more relatively recent thing, and that is that people have the idea that that their cleric worships a principle or a philosophy or a concept. Like maybe a cleric worships light, but doesn't have any specifics. Doesn't necessarily say I worship this deity of light. They just say I worship the light.
Yeah, I do like kind of like loosely describing it like animism, a cleric of ideas, principles, general spirits, and things like that. I do like that concept, and I really do think that even in 5e, there's mechanical options that really lean into that. That just about any domain you could argue can be some sort of animistic belief. The ones that come to mind immediately are like nature, trickery, even war. Like these tend to be a little bit more less like they don't have to be a specific god. Like you are doing it based on principle, kind of leaning into the zone of the paladin where it's like an oath or an idea that you uphold. And I do love that concept. I like the idea that you are so pure in your ideals that it grants you power from within, or maybe some spirit, or just the natural world, that if you become so pure, it's almost like monk-like, where if you become so pure of body and mind, you are given supernatural powers. I do love that. It's very cool.
Yeah, I like the idea of like the divine intervention occurring and a cleric just standing up and saying, "I'm not done yet."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like a grave cleric standing up, looking more or less like an undead, but going, "I'm not done yet, and my deity agrees with me."
Yeah. That's the idea. So we'll talk about this with other class choices, but like clerics is the first one that we've touched on, to where you are effectively in a way creating, if not creating, but at least attaching yourself to a pre-established NPC that is arguably all powerful. So that should give your DM a lot of things to play with. Like you are forcing an NPC into this campaign because maybe when it comes to a cleric's god, it has no, like, the DM doesn't use it at all because it's just the gods over there doing their own thing, or the spirit or whatever. But I think as a DM, you should take a hard look at, because your player just handed you an all-powerful NPC, that you should be using that all-powerful NPC for, against, neutral to the party. It has, you have tools, use them.
Indeed, indeed. And it's important to try and establish and have a clear communication with your player or your GM, depending on what side of the table you are on, what the god is like, and what your character is like, and where there's overlap and where there's not.
Yep.
Like your god might be more zealous than you are, and then you have to start compromising when there's a situation that might not get resolved through pure zealotry.
Mm-hmm. Well, then there's always the question, as levels progress, you are granted more and more power by, like, straight mechanical sense. Like, it's hard to get around that. Like, there's not really good ways that you can explain around it. Like, no, I'm not actually getting more power, but ideally, that's kind of the idea. You're given more power from that god. So eventually it's going to get to the point where you might have enough power that you are near godlike yourself. And there's all kinds of questions that come from that. Like, are you directly taking the power? Is the power being handed to you? Do you find out later, based on all this magic, this high level of divination magic, that it's actually not the god itself, or like a lesser being or servitor of that god, that has tapped you? Like, there's all kinds of questions that come from just you're a cleric, that your DM can really, really just do entire arcs. You can do a level 1 to 20 campaign based on one cleric's god. Like, you can do an entire game based on that. And to me, that's massively important. And if you have a cleric in the party, it should be not something that you just go, oh, that was their class choice, throw it away. You should spend a lot of time as a DM figuring out what exactly that means.
Yeah, and what that means in the society or culture you are in.
Yeah.
Various cultures have very different relationships to their clergy. In certain religions, the clergy really stands with the common man and does the work and does their part, and in others, they are hailed, raised on high, and the common man cleans the street before them before they walk.
Mm-hmm.
What does this mean for your character? Is this are these cultural trends something they agree with or disagree with, or is it something that they just haven't questioned until they went out adventuring, and now they need to consider what impact it actually has on the clergy to be raised on high or not?
And you have to deal with what happens if you go to a city where your religion, or religion in general, is outlawed. What do you do if you go into a city where your religion is already established, but it's a sect that is wildly different from your beliefs and is actually antagonistic to the people there, and they see them as a threat? Are you going to try to hide who you are? Are you going to be even more boisterous about you and your beliefs to try to undermine the damage that's been done by that religion? But then you have to deal with them wanting to deal with you, because you're making them look bad, worse than they already look when they're trying to hold a thumb down or whatever's going on. Like, just the differences of region based on religions can have a huge impact on how it's perceived. And it could be the same exact sect, but it's a bad actor who leads that religious organization. Like, there's so much there to draw from the well for a cleric. It's just you could write infinitely about a single cleric.
Yeah, I have in my setting, there's a region that it's basically like an empire primarily run by hobgoblins.
Mm-hmm.
And their history is that they used to be servants of a deity, but they broke free from that service, and their approach nowadays is rely on us, rely on iron, don't trust any deities, any power, any being that comes from on high and tells you things.
Yep.
Trust in our collective, in the group. And they've been being hobgoblins, they're warlike, but there are times when even they need to do peace agreements or ceasefires at the very
Yeah,
least.
diplomatic
But like,
forces.
yeah, but their very first principle, if you ever want to do any diplomatic work with them, is that no symbols of worship are allowed anywhere near the discussions, because they don't want anyone of a religious bent to be within sight, or they will be tempted to get aggressive.
That's actually pretty cool. That's a concept that you really also have to work on, is the idea of um, when you have these religious individuals, why, and these organizations, and that have this ability to draw this power, why aren't the religious organizations in charge of various cities, regions, countries? Why aren't the religions in charge? If this is a way that you can gain power, like literal, like magical power, you have to answer that as a DM. Why aren't
Yeah.
they in charge? Or maybe they are. But you have to answer that critical question, and I think clerics play a huge point in that. How common are your clerics? We talked briefly about that. How common are your clerics? How easy is it for people to derive this power? From my view, it's a cleric type power would be the easiest for anybody to get. It just intense piety. Now, there could be reasons in your setting why it's not. For me, it's extraordinarily rare. It's not just piety that does it. You have to be chosen. So that's why it's not the easiest way to get power. But you really have to do your due diligence as a DM and understand why these religious orders are or are not in charge, and how many of them have power, and how they use this power. And it lends to a lot of, if you like a political game, religious organizations and clerics and things like that play heavily into a political style game. So
yeah, the trickery domain has so much there. Like, maybe you ask, why aren't the clerics in power? Maybe they are, but nobody knows.
Yep. I love every domain, don't get me wrong. Like, there's no domain I don't like, but trickery is one that's pretty near and dear to my heart. I ran a trickery cleric for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the Go ahead.
Go on, you first.
No, I was just gonna say that there's just so much to go with clerics that I could just I could keep going on forever about it, but I don't know if I have a good rhyme or reason to keep pushing.
An important point I think we need to make is that some, including myself in the past, have had a hard time making a certain distinction, and that distinction is, where does the cleric end and the paladin begin?
I don't know if it's a terribly important distinction, but
and the lines are very flowy and vague. So depending on how your cleric works, and the setting, and the religious grouping and systems and such, it can be very different from one to one. But what I've been trying to think of an example of how would you distinguish these, and like, to put it in a short concept, I would say that the cleric is the voice of a god, while the paladin is the sword of a god. The paladin is the tool being wielded by the deity, whilst the cleric is the one trying to propagate the deity's teachings, so to speak.
I think that's about as good a rule of thumb as that you're going to get at all. I really think it depends on your system, because again, we're talking about super vague terms if we're not talking about system specific. So if we're talking, as we always do, 5e specific, I think that's perfectly a perfectly sound way to do it. Again, you have some blurry lines when you get into like war domain and things like that. But I would have the huge difference for me being, it's the difference between being divinely selected and being entrenched into an oath. I think that is a difference. Where inherently and narratively, I think a cleric is something that has a lot more leeway with their god, because they were chosen. It's not the other way around, right? Whereas in a paladin, if they are religious in their make, it's the other way around. Like, they beckon the power through their oath. So it's a much different relationship with their deity
Yeah.
if there is a deity involved.
Yeah, we'll get into the paladin later, but
Yeah.
if I may mention an example in Norse culture and such, there's a belief that if you make a vow, even if no matter how drunk or out of your mind you are, if you make a vow, you have to do it, and if you don't, you are going to end up miserable and dying in a terrible way, because that's the way fate and the gods work in Norse mythology. That if those who make vows are to uphold them, or they are going to go to a terrible
Well,
fate.
that's why they won't kill Loki despite all of the knowledge that they have about Loki.
Yeah, because at some point, in some text that we do not possess, Loki and Odin swore a pact together, and nobody knows what it was.
Yeah. But yeah, so to go into because there's so much stuff that we can go narratively, but I think we've touched about just about everything important. To kind of, we don't really talk about mechanisms in this, but I think the mechanisms are important to talk about the narrative sometimes. So
Yeah.
we're going to talk about 5e. If you pick a domain, that is massive. That is a massive weight on what it is you're going to be writing and how your character interacts with the world. And I also think that the way divine casting is, especially in 5e specifically, where you are given, without needing to write it down, you are given every spell that is available to you based on your domain and your cleric class. Now you have to kind of do the rites, or however you would describe doing the rites or the preparation methods of like what spells that you have ready for that day. I always like to do it like you do, basically different rituals based on what you're preparing. It doesn't have to be like exact, like noodly stuff, but I like that idea. And that the ability, like if you compare it and contrast to a wizard, where they have like all their stuff written down and they've studied it and all this, you have a cleric who has just, unless you're a wizard who has unlimited money and you've just been writing spells all day long every day, a cleric just has way more spells at their disposal at any given time, and probably has more, has pretty similar amount of prepared spells, but being able to switch with them into days, to me, just goes to the how widely powerful a cleric is. And that how, given one day, they can be prepared for just about any situation. And I don't know, to me, that's something that you should really lean into as a cleric, and then find narrative reasons to talk about that and really explore that, because it's unique to divine casters, and especially because we're going to talk about druids next time, but clerics have a bit more than druids do when it comes to casting.
Yeah.
So that's a huge aspect. I also would urge you that your channel divinity, like, really lean into it. That's an ability that you're going to be using a lot. Lean into how you describe it, how it manifests, and even how it changes as it gets more powerful. To me, that's a really important aspect about being any class, but a cleric in specific is how you describe these things around you.
Yeah, like for my cleric that I mentioned earlier, the Undertaker, when he casted something like when he casted his I forget the name of it, but his channel divinity as a life cleric, what happened was that veiled entities that looked like they were part of a burial ceremony came down, and like the veil would fall upon the characters, and they would, as the veils then started to dissipate, they rose up with their health back.
Nice.
Yeah, and like their spirit, I forget, is it Spirit Guardians the name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the name of the spell. And basically what happened then was that these veils came down with you only saw the veil, but you could see that there was something underneath it moving, but you only saw that the veil was the only visible part, and it would move around, and they would be moving around and striking at the enemies and such.
Yeah.
That's
And
just one example. There are so many ways you can do it.
yeah. And for me, like, I'm not a huge fan of altering the actual mechanisms of spells or abilities like that. So, like, for instance, I don't like changing the damage type. So some people are like, oh, turn Firebolt into ice just because I'm an ice wizard. I don't personally like doing that because I think it like minorly adjusts CR differences, and it's enough of a difference that I'm like, I don't like that. That I would give maybe some. I'd lean differently for a sorcerer, but we'll talk about that in the sorcerer episode. But what I do like is changing none of the mechanical stuff, but giving reasons why something does damage the way it does, despite looking different. So I had a trickery cleric that I use Sacred Flame as my main one, and being all shadows and voodoo magic and all this stuff. Sacred Flame's kind of a weird spell for like a voodoo practitioner to have, but the way that I described it was basically like a small skull entity that was going into the opponent and pulling out their darkness to be seen in the light. So it was the idea of truth coming out. So that because I have control over shadows, trickery, and all these, these hidden mysteries, that I can show you your truth to the light. And the more evil you are, and the more horrible you are, the more damage that you take, because the inverse of trickery is truth. I'm able to control your trickery against you. And
Yeah.
that's why it was radiant damage, is because I'm exposing your evil. And to me, that was a lot of fun for me to describe the few times in that campaign that I did. And that's kind of how all my spells were. Was that it was something involving shadowy spider. Even like bringing somebody back to life was like smoke going into their nose and actually like working their heart inside them with the smoky tendrils to bring them back.
Yeah, like a concept I've had is the idea of a cleric, of a knowledge cleric that is worshipping a god of secrets to a degree where this god's existence is technically secret. The order is more or less secret. They are how to put it, they do their work, they do what they can, and they are helpful for the community, but they don't really preach, so to speak. They don't really recruit unless someone is really in a position to be taken in by it, or if someone learns something that they shouldn't know, then they are given the option of becoming part of this clergy.
I do like the idea of that concept, but in a weird, almost antagonistic but respectful way, where once you actually glean the information of knowing that God existence, that God notices you and is like, let's see what this thing can do, and then taps you with a little bit of power. And the whole strive that you have to do, your whole reason for being, is to basically learn what this entity is and their infinite knowledge of the entire cosmos. But at no time is that God actually helping you and is actually putting trials and challenges in front of you the whole time, because it has this weird antagonistic respect for you. But like, this little insignificant thing thinks it can know me. Let's see what it can do. I'm having so much fun with you. Let's see. And then every time that you kind of overcome one of these hurdles, it's like, okay, here's a little bit more. Let's see what you can do with one extra tool. And
Yeah.
I could write a whole campaign just on that your big bad is actually your cleric's god, but he's not actually bad. He's just challenging you.
Yeah, and I have it in my setting that there is a one of the deities, which is essentially the deity of the grave domain, is in such a position where they are not capable of directly communicating to anything living. So you have, as a cleric of this deity, you have to have some being, the soul, or some
Vessel.
being vessel in the afterlife that commutes this god's will to you. Like, I have one character she always walks around with the skull of her grandma.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and she refers to the skull as Granny, and she talks with it, and no one else could hear it.
That's cool. I also like the idea of kind of like in a setting where necromancy is kind of a little bit more okay, that they always just kind of have like a zombie bodyguard next to them that every once in a while just starts talking, even though it can't.
Yeah.
Like, it just starts talking out of like its like destroyed neck.
Yeah,
and
what I've had with that character is that she actually runs a store, and the skull is just on the side of the bench. And sometimes while she's just talking with a customer, she'll be like, "Hold on, Granny, stop talking my ear off!" And be like, "I'll get to you, I'll get to you," and everybody's like, that's a skull. What are you? Why are you? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think there's anything else? I think at this point we're just having fun talking about clerics.
At this point we're just bringing up fun examples, but there's essentially an infinite number of ideas you could apply.
Yeah, I would say as my closing remarks, I think the cleric, or the holy man priest, has been a staple of D&D and fantasy medium for basically all of it. I think that's kind of always been there. And I think because it's always been there, we take it for granted. And when somebody says, I'm going to play a cleric, everybody at the table just goes, cool, heals. And nobody really puts any thought into it aside from that. And when I say nobody, I mean, I'm speaking hyperbolic. But
yeah, I like to call that kind of thinking the MMO mindset.
Yes, but I would urge everybody out there, players and DMs alike, that, and the kind of the whole point of this entire series is that class decisions should be heavily weighed on your narrative, and it should be very important to you as a player that just picking a class should be, not should, I would like it to be, and I think you would get more fun out of it if you spent hours actually thinking about what that decision means. And I think clerics are no exception to this. I think among all three that we've talked about so far, clerics are actually probably the heaviest weight on the narrative based on making that decision if you choose to be a cleric. That so far there is no weightier decision on the entire arc of the narrative because of what you're introducing. You are introducing an all-powerful NPC. Maybe. I don't know. Depends on what your cleric is.
And not every cleric and not every religious order or clergy knows everything there is to know about their deity. So there's plenty of mysteries and questions to be answered.
Yep, and it should be like that. I really do think, and I will say hard should. Yeah, I'm taking a hard stance here. Have fun my way. But the true closing remark is clerics are wonderfully powerful when it comes to your narrative writing, and they should be respected as such. And I would hope that we have illuminated slightly on that impact that clerics can have in your narrative. And I hope your games are better because you have put deeper emphasis on what it is to be a cleric. Do you have any closing remarks?
Not just that, like, I've heard stories of people who effectively play a cleric of Asmodeus in a generally good party and so on. And that is not to say that it's critical, but he is, the character is very lawful, very organized, and they respect and work with everyone. And like, these things are possible if you can handle it responsibly, and if the GM can handle it as well. Of course, something like that you would need to discuss with your GM ahead of time, but there is, as I said, almost infinite possibilities so long as you can communicate them effectively with your GM.
Someday we'll do an evil character video, and then we'll go deep into that. But all right, thank you guys so much. I know this was a little bit of a longer one, but clerics are a big deal, so hopefully you had fun and you stuck with us through the end. And thank you if you did. And we will see you next time in this class discussion when we're talking about druids.
Yeah.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.